Descending Hawksley Hill from Colchester, the visitor has a first glimpse of Nayland lying in the valley of the River Stour, which was the division between the ancient kingdom of East Anglia and Essex. The river has always been important to Nayland, probably having more influence on its development and prosperity than any other factor. It was made navigable by Act of Parliament in 1705, and for 200 years barges travelled from Sudbury to Manningtree via the mills and wharves of Nayland and Wiston. There was much industry here at that time, including milling, tanning, brewing, malting and soap making, but long before this, Nayland had known prosperity through the woolen cloth trade. Entering the village over the Anchor Bridge, also known as Able Bridge, one of 3 bridges on the site, we enter Court Street, once described as the preferable part of the town. There are several interesting buildings here, including Stour House, a 16th century clothmaker's house, deceptively disguised by a 19th century brick facade. Along the street, number 17 is a 14th century cottage which was the post office in the 19th century, and the nearby butcher's shop, built in the 16th century, was once the Shoulder of Mutton alehouse. The row of 15th and 16th century cottages on the opposite side of Court Street housed a saddler, a tailor, and the Victoria Public House in the 19th and 20th centuries. Next door, Knoll Gate is a house of 15th century origin, and it stands at the entrance to Court Knoll, a field believed to be the original site of Nayland. The origins of Nayland are shrouded in mystery, but archaeological finds have proved that there was habitation in the area 3,000 or 4,000 years ago. The Anglo-Saxon name for Nayland was Island, meaning at the island. And this field of about 5 acres close to the river, surrounded by a deep ditch, is known as Court Knoll, and it is a registered ancient monument. Records tell us that there was a Norman manor house and chapel on Court Knoll, but in 1768, Morant's History of Essex states that only the remains of the chapel could be seen. An excavation in the 1920s uncovered the foundations of a building made of Roman tiles and flint, and in the 1990s it was decided to investigate further. Geophysical and field walking surveys involving many villagers took place in 2001. This was followed in 2016 by a major excavation in which many more members of the community took part. More of the chapel was uncovered, and there were many interesting finds, including unusual glass fragments and tiles dating from the 13th century or earlier, leading experts to believe the Anglo-Saxon chapel may have been of very high status. It is hoped that further investigations can be made in the future. As the buildings on the Court Knoll fell into disuse, the village gradually moved to its present site. St. James's Church in the High Street was built around 1400, at a time when the woolen cloth trade brought prosperity to Nayland, although it contains features of an earlier building. Until the 18th century, it was a chapel of ease to Stoke by Nayland. It was rebuilt in the 16th century and has been modified and extended ever since. The 14th century tower was completely restored in 1963 as a result of damage caused during the Great Essex earthquake of 1884. It is the home of a rare altar painting by John Constable, who had 2 aunts living in Nayland. In 1809, One of these aunts commissioned her nephew to paint this picture, which is entitled Christ Blessing Bread and Wine. On the 1st of March 1944, First Lieutenant Charles Gumm of the US Air Force, who was on a training flight from nearby Boxted Airfield, lost his life when his controls failed and his Mustang plane crashed. He narrowly managed to avoid the village before his plane hit the ground. A village grateful for this avoidance of loss of life held a memorial service for him some days later, and a seat dedicated to him was put in the church's burial ground, and his name was later added to the roll of honour inside the church. In 2001, the parish council replaced the old seat with a new seat, which was placed next to the village war memorial in the High Street. The most important house in Nayland, and worthy of its Grade 1 listed building status, is Alston Court, which stands in a prominent position facing the High Street. Previously called Grooms, the house is rich in architectural detail of various periods. In the 15th century, it was the home of a wealthy cloth-making family, but has been considerably altered since then. To the rear of the building, there is a stunning enclosed courtyard, which was added in the 16th century. The house was restored in 1902. For many years, there was a theory that originally the building comprised two houses on either side of a lane until they were joined in the 15th century by the central hall now facing the street. However, about 40 years ago, experts discovered that the earliest part of the house is in fact on the right of the imposing 17th century doorway and dates from around 1300. For more than 200 years from the 18th century, it was the home of the Alston family, who gave it their name. Facing the High Street, in front of Alston Court, the row of houses built in the 16th century, now called Church Mews, was originally one house, which has been transformed over the centuries. It is believed to have rivaled Alston Court with its imposing frontage and elaborately decorated timbers. Little is known of its early history, but it was thought to have once been a wool exchange. In the High Street is an 18th century obelisk inscribed 55 miles from London. The pillory and stocks stood here and were last used in 1855 by a tall man called Plampin for causing a disturbance in church. People took pity on him and gave him beer, a pipe, and tobacco. Not surprisingly, many of the buildings in the High Street, which was formerly the marketplace, were originally shops and businesses which have gradually disappeared over the years. Number 8 High Street, a 15th century house, was a butcher's from the 19th century until 1974, and across the road the post office, of 15th century origin, is believed to have been the Rose Inn and later a chemist and coffee tavern before becoming the post office in 1901. Next door, Vine House is one of the many houses in the village with a brick frontage that hides an earlier structure. For 200 years, this 16th century house was the Vine Inn, which closed in 1909. The White Hart Inn, formerly the Crown, was built as a hostelry in the 15th century, and it has been used as such for 600 years, but now it stands empty, its future uncertain. On the first floor, there are some 18th century wall paintings reputed to have been painted by Thomas Gainsborough's brother. Close by, the Queen's Head on the banks of the Mill Stream was a coaching inn from the late 14th century until it closed in the 1950s. It is an important building that has been much altered over the centuries. The Commissioners of the Stour Navigation, a prestigious body charged with maintaining the navigability of this important waterway, met there from 1781 until 1914. Opposite the Queen's Head, the remains of Nayland's corn mill can be seen. The earliest record of a mill on this site dates from the 17th century, and it was rebuilt in the 18th century. In 1823, it was again rebuilt, this time into a 6-story structure with a gantry over the road to the mill lade, where barges came to load up with flour from the mill. In 1922, the top 3 stories and gantry were dismantled, and soon after, it became the Nayland Electric Light and Power Station, which closed in 1938. Since then, the building has been used by many businesses and is now partly residential. Despite its present-day idyllic appearance, Fenn Street was the industrial centre of Nayland in the 19th century. There have been many businesses there, including a steam flour mill, a silk works with its own gasworks, a tannery, a straw and rope factory, a wheelwright, and many others. Until the 20th century, the sight of cattle being taken from their grazing on the Fenn, a field at the bottom of Fenn Street, for milking at the Guildhall in the High Street, was a daily event. The mill stream was constructed in the 17th century, and before that it was not necessary to cross bridges to enter the houses on the northern side of Fenn Street. There are several 15th and 16th century houses and cottages of great interest here. The ancient house at the top of Fenn Street was an important merchant's house of the 16th century with elaborate timbering, and the 15th century cottage at number 9 is particularly notable for being one of the smallest medieval open halls in the country. Birch Street is a unique street of great architectural importance. With few exceptions, the whole of Birch Street comprises cottages dating from the 14th to the 16th centuries, which are all different and have remarkably survived largely intact. The exposed timbers are an indication of the varying styles and periods of their construction. Some of the houses would originally have been business premises and workshops, and until the 1950s, number 4 was one of Nayland's 3 bakeries. Birch Street, formerly known as Birch Street, has many important buildings, including Butcher's, a 16th century merchant's house with fine timbering, but much altered. It was once an alehouse known as the Butcher's Arms until the 1950s, and it took its name from the adjoining butcher's shop. Across the road, Clare Cottage was a master weaver's house, but the date 1690 shown in the decorative plasterwork on its frontage is misleading, as the house contains the remains of an earlier house within its framework. Number 12 Birch Street is one of the finest 16th century merchants' houses in Nayland. Its frontage disguises its much altered original structure, but inside its beautiful moulded ceilings clearly indicate the wealth of its original owner. Next to number 48 is a piece of common land, which was a medieval horse watering, a place where horses could drink in the mill lade that runs along behind the houses on this side of the street. A bridge across this common land leads to the former Nayland lock keeper's cottage. The lock was replaced by a weir in 1947. Nayland is a village with an extraordinary sense of history. Fortunately, it is also blessed with a very strong community spirit, as is exemplified by the many organizations which thrive within its small population. The Nayland with Wiston Conservation Society is one of these organizations, and a number of its members have contributed to make this film possible. Our thanks go to them, and to our scriptwriter Wendy Sparrow, our narrator Peter Drew, and most importantly, to our cameraman Stuart Howells.